It comes as a no surprise that the game is a very divisive game. On one hand, Final Fantasy XVI is a Final Fantasy game, complete with all the mythological beings that we all come to know and love, while having a mix of sci-fi technology and magic altogether that we've seen countless times on the other titles of the franchise. And with these mythological beings and magic that we see our main characters stand united against their fate and destiny and save all of humankind from whatever egotistical god they've picked a fight with. Not to mention the absolutely stunning graphical fidelity that Final Fantasy became to be known for, with photorealistic graphics and character models. On the other, it's a brand new uncharted territory. It's an action game that heavily focuses on executing flashy combos and abilities, seemingly abolishing the long-standing established strategy genre from the past dozen or so titles that the game has released to cater more to a broader, more modern audiences that may not be so inclined to be playing turn-based video games or something similar to the sort in this day and age, with a really dark tonal shift in the story that are rarely seen in Final Fantasy games. So how does the game fare, really? In a personal standpoint, Final Fantasy XVI is a fantastic game, and a really great Final Fantasy game. I have always been a person that wanted to play a Final Fantasy game like it was a movie that you can interact with, and Final Fantasy XVI, as well as its predecessor in the two Final Fantasy VII remakes, is a game that certainly scratched that itch for me. The graphical fidelity of the game alone is a real treat that it's sometimes hard to differentiate if it is shot in the real world or if the scene was just pre-rendered 3D simulation of a landscape. Of course, all of these are 3D renders, but you get my idea. Final Fantasy XVI tells a very gripping story that departs from Final Fantasy XV's very rushed and confusing narrative. While the latter game felt like you were forcefully being pushed towards the end of the game constantly, only to be barred by countless side quests where it felt like the developers took more time designing them than the actual main storyline, Final Fantasy XVI offers a very comprehensive, well-thought-out narrative that makes you connect and sympathize with the characters that you meet on your journey, and not to mention the side quests that only further solidifies the already established world building of the game. The game gives you very limiting combos and abilities at the start of the game, but it soon opens up to a plethora of selection that allows you to customize abilities and special moves that you can use for different types of scenarios, making for a very dynamic and overall non-constraining battle system that will rack your brain on the perfect build that suits your playstyle. Of course, there will be meta rotations and combos, but for the most part, players have the freedom to choose what they think looks cool or what's right for them. To sum up the summary of what the game is all about, all I can say is that despite what people have been saying about Final Fantasy XVI, I think it's worth a try. The game does have a demo available to see if it is the game for you. One thing that I can tell people that are going in the game blind for the first time is, do not expect to see a Final Fantasy Devil May Cry love child, and instead, treat the game as its own unique standalone individual. Without those expectations to blur your judgment, I think it can make you realize that Final Fantasy XVI is a great game. If those are enough to convince you to at least try out the demo of the game yourself, or even buy the game outright, then the link to the game's Steam store page will be in the description down below. If you want to dive into the depths of the game, then feel free to stick around. We're in for a long ride. Final Fantasy XVI is a Final Fantasy game, so yeah, I think there are no questions about how gorgeous the game looks. Once again, Square Enix opted for photorealistic graphics where each terrain and landscape feels like they popped out of existence right from the real world. Character designs are pretty decent. The developers look like they went for a somewhat more realistic clothings as opposed to other titles. To be perfectly honest, only our main character's outfit is the only ridiculous looking one. The rest of the characters sport something that you may more or less see in a medieval fantasy setting of a story. But even that is justifiable as he is somewhat of a special kind of man, the very man that the game's egotistical god is seeking after. Each ability in the game also has their own unique flair and visual effects, boasting myriads of colors and bloom effects, and intensity that signifies just how strong each ability is. Although some of them can be eye candy and become screen clutter, especially the ultimate moves of some of the skill trees available, where it becomes very hard to see what's actually happening on the screen that can result in getting damaged by enemies instead of the other way around. One of the things that I really commend Square Enix for with this game is how your character retains their equipped weapon and clothes through cutscenes, even the cinematic ones. In Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII, the game retains the equipment you give to Lightning during the in-game cutscenes, but few as they may, it gets replaced by what the game thinks Lightning should be wearing at that point in the game during cinematic ones. This is especially apparent during the final cinematic cutscene of the game, where she reverts back to her starting gear in the cutscene. It doesn't affect gameplay that much, but it still feels a bit jarring to see, especially for people like me where immersion and continuity are very important. Final Fantasy XVI, however, uses whatever you equip Clive with even during cinematic cutscenes. Granted, the only thing that changes with him is the sword equipped, and there are only 2 clothes that you can choose from, but it is still a very nice feature to be included in the game, so props to Square Enix for that. The UI design is pretty intuitive enough and very easy to navigate. The game opted for you to see your character's stats and equip items and abilities in just a single page instead of manually navigating through his items while equipping. Of course, there's a separate page to select your weapons, armors, accessories, and loadout of abilities. You can also go directly to the world map and back to the local map in just 2 button presses. If you decide to fast travel to another fast travel point while looking at the local map of the place you are currently in, there's no need to exit out of the local map just to get to the world map. You get to do it with just a single button press. And it works the other way around. If you want to see the local map of a place from your world map, all it takes is just 1 button press. You don't need to go back to a menu just to access the local map. The soundtrack of Final Fantasy XVI is one of the best yet in the franchise, featuring dark, epic orchestral scores that heavily complements the brooding story that the game has. As with most Final Fantasy titles, most of the soundtrack consists of different arrangements of some of the most iconic backend tracks of previous games, like the Final Fantasy Prelude theme song and battle music, but the game also consists of soundtracks very unique to it, which strongly separates it apart from its peers. As we will be learning later in the video, Final Fantasy XVI is a very dark game. A dark fantasy that's quite unique to the Final Fantasy franchise, and the music scores that it has just further solidifies this distinction. I think an example will better explain the feeling of what Final Fantasy XVI's tone is. This is The Lion and the Hare, the Knights of the File, one of the many epic scores that the game has that uses an arrangement of the Prelude theme song. This was used in the opening cutscene of the game and sets the tone of the whole game properly. It starts off with a dark, booming, foreboding orchestral piece as if telling the players that this is a game unlike anything that they've seen in the franchise. The rising tension of the score in the middle only amplifies the dread and brooding tone of the game's theme. But as it goes on, the iconic prelude motif suddenly enters the piece with a very smooth transition, with the booming and foreboding orchestral piece almost overpowering it, but still reassuring the players that what they're about to enter is still a Final Fantasy experience. This next example is a personal favorite of mine, titled Find the Flame. It's a triumphant orchestral score that perfectly reflects the scene where the piece first plays out. The moment that our main protagonist accepts himself for who he is and embraces the dark infernal being that is inside him. There really isn't anything else to say about this piece. It's an upbeat orchestral piece for a climatic portion of the game, and I just love it so much. This is the very first Final Fantasy game that I played on the English dub. I'm usually a Japanese dub enjoyer, especially on weeb games like this, because most of the time, the English dub really sounds awful. And this is something that people misunderstand about me. I don't hate English dubs, I just prefer the Japanese dubs 9 times out of 10 because the English dubs for this game sounds fucking awful. But this time in Final Fantasy XVI, it's the other way around. It's the Japanese dub that sounds really awful. And not only that, but the way the script is laid out and how the dialogues were written really tells the players that, yes, this is a game that is meant to be played in the English dub. The Japanese dub was there for accessibility. And the most damning evidence as to why the game is meant to be played in English are the lip-sync animations. The game's lip-sync animations are only exclusive to the English dub. So just be warned, if you're a Japanese dub enjoyer like me, you might be taken aback by the lip-sync animations and how awkward the Japanese dub sounds on this game. English dub is the way to go. As far as the game performance goes on PC, it's kinda bad. This is one of the few complaints that people had about the game. It's that it has very poor optimization for the PC release. Now, I don't have the strongest PC setup out there, I'll have it posted down in the description below, but I don't think I should be expecting a lot of micro stutters. And it becomes so bad to the point that I get very low FPS. The lowest I got is 22 FPS in the Greenlands just outside of Martha's Rest, one of the very first areas that you will be visiting when you first play the game. All the footage you're seeing in this video is me playing the game at medium graphics settings at 1080p, so if you have a system that's weaker than the one I have, then be warned that you may have to further lower your settings just to have stable FPS. I do hit 60 FPS for about 70% of the time and have better FPS when not recording, but still, I feel like I shouldn't at least be hitting low 20s with my rig, especially on important battles like boss fights. Overall, I don't think anyone has any issues with graphics and visual fidelity when it comes to a Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy games are some of the most beautiful games that one can play in this day and age, and there's no questioning the quality of Final Fantasy XVI as well. If nothing else, just the graphics alone can make you say that Final Fantasy XVI is a Final Fantasy game. But I think the story can say that a lot better. The story of Final Fantasy XVI is a far cry from what Final Fantasy XV had. Final Fantasy XVI returns back to its root as a JRPG, where at the beginning everything seems so mundane and you only do some trivial stuff relative to the game's story anyways, and then after some 60 odd hours you're up in the sky killing a god. And while Final Fantasy XV also had some dark undertones in its story, with all the dead family members and fiancé and fighting your angry and dying uncle, Final Fantasy XVI starts dark already, and it only continues to become darker as the game progresses. You play as Clive Rosfield, the sworn shield and older brother of the Dominant of Fire, Joshua Rosfield, prince to the throne of the Kingdom of Rosaria, and son to the Archduke Elwyn. During the prologue of the game, the Kingdom of Rosaria is getting ready to get back one of their territories, and as tradition dictates, the chosen Dominant of the Icon Phoenix shall go to Phoenix Gate and commune with his ancestors before going into battle. And of course, that's where all things went wrong. There's a really long cutscene showing what happened. There are a lot of cutscenes during the first few hours of the game. So the gist of it is the Emperor of Oriflamme betrays Rosaria, attacked the Rosarian army during the night before Joshua is supposed to commune with the ancestors, and the king gets decapitated, thus plunging the whole of Rosaria into chaos and eventually steer it towards its downfall. Not even an hour into the game and the dark tones of the game is already made apparent by the cutscenes. Anyways, after that, being the Dominant of Fire, Joshua transformed into the Phoenix in hopes of quelling the invasion of the Empire and to avenge his father. However, not soon after, a second Dominant of Fire emerged, Ifrit, and started to fight the Phoenix. After a lengthy fight between the two incredible beings of fire, the Phoenix, and in turn Joshua gets killed by Ifrit, and Rosaria finally falls to the hands of the Empire. 13 years after that, Clive is now a branded, owned by the Empire, a slave. He follows every bidding of the Empire that he gets told to do because he only has one thing on his mind: to find the second dominant of fire to transform into Ifrit and killed his brother. In this moment, we are introduced to more of the icons that exist in the world, Shiva and Titan, who were currently duking it out in each other as the Dalmatian Republic, a territory situated in the desert, and the Iron Kingdom battles it out. Clive and his team of Branded's mission is to kill the dominant of Shiva while the two warring nations are caught up in the battlefield. And they nearly succeed, until Clive realizes that the dominant of Shiva is his childhood friend, a friend that he wasn't able to see for 13 years after the fall of Rosaria. Learning about this, he betrays his fellow Branded to protect his friend, killing his captain in the process. Clive carries his unconscious friend out of the battlefield with nowhere to go, until they get found by an outlaw named Sid who helped them escape. In many more turns of events, Clive finds out that Sid has leads about the dominant of fire that he has been seeking his whole life. And so he joins Sid momentarily to follow these leads. And that's just the prologue of the game. I have left out so many other events that have happened because I don't just want the section to become an hour-long recounting of the first few hours of the game, but hopefully with those non-spoiler synopsis of the prologue, you get the idea of what's happening. The subplot of the game is figuring out how to stop the Blight, the darkening of the planet's land where nothing can ever survive. At some point in the game, it is revealed that the Blight exists because of the mother crystals that are housed with the several kingdoms of the land. Large crystals that allow people to use magic through the use of smaller crystals. One of Sid's main goals in the game is to destroy all of the mother crystals in hopes of stopping the spread of the Blight. And while all of these are happening, we also get to see how the people of the Empire treat their Branded. Aside from figuring out who killed Clive's brother and how to destroy the mother crystals that are heavily guarded in their respective kingdoms, players will also encounter missions where Clive gets to help his fellow Branded, and as the players, learn just how much injustice they suffer. Square Enix actually did a good job of portraying those that mistreat their Branded that sometimes I personally just didn't want to save the people from whatever incident happens in one of the towns in the game. In contrast to the almost happy-go-lucky bros go on an adventure story of Final Fantasy XV, Final Fantasy XV's story is pretty bleak and, as many times as I've mentioned it, dark. You don't often see a character get decapitated in a Final Fantasy game, but here we get to see one does in less than an hour. The game is also very bloody and is not afraid to depict the horrifying consequences and aftermath of war. All of these sound very confusing when I'm the one telling them, but as you play the game, all of this makes sense actually. The reason why there are a lot of cutscenes at the beginning of the game is to solidify its world building. The world of Final Fantasy XVI is fantastic and very nuanced, and it will take hours just to explain each of the meticulous lore behind it. The game also features a lot of side quests, and while they seem mundane and just a bunch of fetch quests at first, they significantly help in furthering the world building of the game. A fetch quest in the game isn't just a fetch quest for the sake of it, but instead they add to the lore and give more exposition. While it may feel like the game only revolves around Clive, adding this side quest counteracts this as the NPCs involved with the side quests often comment on the current state of the world or add interesting tidbits of lore and information. These side quests don't affect the ending of the game in any shape or form, even if you were inclined to think otherwise, but they are still a nice feature to be added into the game. And I think that's also perfectly to do side quests. If you decide to do them, they add free lore and exposition, and if you don't, well, it really doesn't affect you or the story in any way, giving players the choice of doing them or not, and not to be forced to do them just because they want to see a different ending. Final Fantasy XVI is one of the few Final Fantasy games where the characters are really fleshed out. And this is all thanks to the hours of cutscenes in the beginning. Not only are the characters fleshed out, but the emotions that they carry with them in the dialogues and in the script, the way they interact with each other is something that I think Final Fantasy games couldn't do that well most of the time. Final Fantasy XVI always shows us raw emotions for the characters, whether it's them crying from farewells, mourning deaths, or just really angry at the world or at themselves. The game never fails to capture you with such raw emotional interactions. And of course, you top it all off with the amazing soundtrack. This is also one of the few times where a Final Fantasy game ended in a bittersweet tone. Most of the Final Fantasy games that I have played so far had happy endings. Final Fantasy XV was the first one that I've played that didn't give a happy ending. We all know that the bros died during the final confrontation, even though it wasn't explicitly shown or stated. Final Fantasy XVI, to avoid any spoilers, doesn't have a happy ending as well, but it does end on a really sweet tone, thus a bittersweet ending. In short, Final Fantasy XVI has a very strong world as its foundation, and the lore and exposition it gives to the players through the tremendous amount of cutscenes at the start perfectly culminates into a cohesive, coherent, and well-written narrative that ties everything together for a heartfelt, bittersweet finale. Not to mention the very in-depth character that carry us through the story. And what better way to experience the story that the game has to offer than with an explosive, fast-paced combat system. Everyone knows the change in gameplay that Square Enix did with Final Fantasy XVI. And believe me, as much as I love this game and praise it, I was not a fan of the change at first. I, for one, really fucking hate Devil May Cry's combat. But I also am not the one to complain when a developer tries to change some things up. And as it turns out, the change they did for Final Fantasy XVI was a good one. We've seen this change in combat structure a couple of games back, but it didn't help that the first game to do so, Final Fantasy XV, was received kind of poorly by its target audience, being really rushed and having a very nonsensical story overall, not to mention how mind-numbingly simple and easy the game's combat was. Can we say the same for Final Fantasy XVI? No, I don't think so. The first few hours of the game will feel very boring. Clive only has access to the power of the Phoenix bestowed upon him by Joshua when he was knighted as his Sworn Shield, and he can only perform 2 special abilities at a time. But you really should savor this moment though, because after about 20-30 hours, you won't have enough ability slots to put in your favorite skills and abilities. And this is where Final Fantasy XVI differs from Final Fantasy XV and why it has more depth in its combat system. At some point in the game, you will gain not 3, not 4, but 7 different skill trees to choose from, 9 if you have one of the DLCs, and 3 icon slots containing 2 skill slots each to put abilities into. And each skill tree contains 4 different abilities to choose from. It is up to the players to fill up the skill slots with the ability of their own choosing. They may take abilities that focus on doing pure raw damage, some may opt into low cooldown skills so they can dish out damaging abilities frequently. Players may also opt in to make a skill loadout that deals fast AoE damage for trash mobs, or a skill loadout that can easily whittle the will bar for boss and pair it with high damaging skills to easily burst down the boss's HP bar. Huh? What will bar you say? Let me explain. Stagger is pretty much an industry standard at this point when it comes to RPGs, and Final Fantasy XVI is no stranger to this mechanic. It's called the will bar in this game, and it's one of the 3 goals that you have during mini-boss and boss fights. Depleting the will bar fully will make the enemy enter the staggered state, a mechanic we've seen hundreds of times, and damage you do to them will be amplified by a multiplier that can be affected by various abilities. The highest multiplier that you can achieve in a normal playthrough is 1.5 times your damage. With the Echoes of the Fallen DLC, this can be increased to 2.0 times, meaning you deal twice the damage you would normally would. And with the Rise of the Tides DLC, this can be increased to 2.2 times your normal damage, but this can only be achieved inside a specific game mode. The bread and butter of the game is making sure that you can quickly deplete the boss's will bar, while at the same time have enough high damage abilities to attempt to reduce the boss's HP bar as much as you can before the stagger state ends. You also need to be careful though, because of course some of the high damaging abilities mostly perform poorly when faced with a group of enemies, so there's some brainstorming and theory crafting involved in making your skill loadouts, making sure that you have enough will and HP damaging skills but just have enough AoE skills to deal with trash mobs. The second goal you have during mini-boss and boss fights is of course depleting the enemy's HP bar. But the third one is being fast enough to make the enemy half staggered. You see, the enemy's will bar has a notch in the middle. Once their will bar reaches this notch, they will enter a half stagger state where they get stunned for a few seconds, cancelling most or all attacks they might be currently doing and prevent them from doing any more attacks until they recover from the animation. This opens up the enemy to be barraged by a bunch of abilities and combos, or allows the players to take a breather and recover HP or take a moment to reassess their own situation. Unlike Devil May Cry, the normal attack combos that you can do in this game are very limited. Personally, this really works for my case because I hate having to unlock a bunch of combos that I really won't be using, but then be pissed at myself for not using them. When I play Devil May Cry games, I mostly leave most of the moves locked because I cannot be bothered to keep track of all the combos. I don't have this issue with Final Fantasy 16. Instead, Final Fantasy 16 relies on the various abilities that you can use to give complexity to the combat system. The skill trees I've mentioned earlier are the various icons that Clive absorbs throughout the game, which allows him to use the abilities of each to decimate his enemies. Players can configure up to 5 icon loadouts, each loadout consisting of 3 icon slots, and each icon slot containing 2 icon abilities. Players can only use the icons and abilities that are in the current loadout that they chose, and the loadout cannot be changed while in combat, and abilities can only be equipped in skill slots that are contained in their respective icon slot, meaning an ability from, say, Phoenix cannot be equipped into a skill slot where Garuda is equipped. Players then cycle through their equipped icons in their loadout by pressing the corresponding button on their preferred input device, L2 or left trigger on the gamepad. This makes players build around a well-rounded build that can deal with a group of trash mobs, but at the same time having enough abilities that can deal decent build and HP damage to bosses when they come up, as well as coming up with a way to cycle through these abilities because of the limited way that they can be equipped. Of course, if you're on your second playthrough, this won't matter because you'll have an idea on when a boss will show up and adjust your loadout accordingly, or have a well-rounded loadout that can deal with both since you will most likely have unlocked most if not all of the abilities. But for a first playthrough that may last between 30 to 80 hours, preparing your loadout accordingly is a must. This makes for a dynamic build system where every player will surely have different abilities in their loadouts. Each icon offers 4 different abilities, each having their own different cooldown timers and damaging and will damaging capabilities. One of these 4 abilities will always be an ultimate, high cooldown, high damage abilities. There are no correct or incorrect abilities to use in any situation, as all of your decisions will depend on your kind of playstyle. If you like the flashy, high damage ultimate abilities despite their long cooldowns, you can fill your loadout with ultimate abilities. If you want a well-balanced loadout, you can fill your loadout with a combination of a short cooldown skills with ultimates. Some people even opt for low cooldown abilities that they can spam. These abilities can also be upgraded, giving them upgrade bonuses like more hits, more damage, or more summon instances for abilities that summon entities, but they can also be mastered. Once an ability is mastered, you can put an ability in any skill slot regardless of what icon is equipped in an icon slot, which further opens up a lot of possibilities in building a perfect loadout. Aside from 4 abilities, each icon has their own unique skill called Iconic Feat. Iconic feats are unique skills that integrate themselves into Clive's normal combos as opposed to abilities that have cooldowns. Iconic feats can be used an indefinite number of times depending on the feat. The reason why there's a need to equip an icon of your choosing even though mastering an ability allows you to put your ability on an equipped icon is that you can only use the iconic feat of the icon that you are currently equipped with. So decide on the icons that you like the feats of the most, put abilities that you think will synergize well with the iconic feats, and put your icons in your loadout in an order that makes sense to you during combat. For example, in my instance, I have Shiva as my first icon in my loadout, equipped with Bahamut's satellite ability and Shiva's very own Diamond Dust ultimate. I have the setup because I use Shiva as an opener that depletes an enemy's will bar while dodging their attacks, which for the latter, Shiva's iconic feat is good for. My second icon is Odin because of his ability Rift Sleep, which is basically a legal intentional animation cancel, which I very much would like to do after using Shiva's Diamond Dust, since it has a very long ending animation that I don't really need. Plus, I usually follow up with Wind Up, Titan's ability which I equip on my third icon Bahamut after the wheel bar is depleted. That requires me to charge it to achieve the most damage with it, which will take up time. Odin's Rift Sleep stops time in-game, which means it also stops the wheel recovery bar, which allows me to maximize my time with Wind Up's charge. I then follow up Wind Up with Bahamut's very own Giga Flare, which I then cancelled the ending animation off with Rift Sleep again to perform Odin's Dancing Steel, which benefits once again from Rift Sleep as the move has a very long starting animation. After Dancing Steel ends, I use Rift Sleep again to get out of the Dancing Steel's long ending animation to immediately go into Zentetsuken using Odin's iconic feat, netting me somewhere around 190 to 200,000 damage while the enemy is staggered every time. And before all of this happened, during the time I deplete the enemy's willbar using Bahamut's Satellite, which is equipped on Shiva, I activate Bahamut's iconic feat, which is my third equipped icon, to charge Mega Flare, which I then use after using Titan's Wind Up when the enemy is staggered to further bombard my enemy with more damage. That took a minute. Without my explanations and slowdowns for me to talk over it, a boss fight should look something like this. And that is just one loadout build out of a myriad of possibilities. I didn't come up with this build obviously, I took a build that was posted online and tweaked it a little bit to suit my kind of playstyle. For some people, they'd say that this build sucks because it relies too much on icon ultimates and Zentetsuken, and that it takes too long to deplete the enemy's build bar, but hey, I'm having fun with it. I like seeing big numbers and watch the enemy's HP bar drain. And that's the beauty of Final Fantasy XVI's combat system. You're free to build setups that's fun for you and suits your kind of playstyle. I know that this is the boiling point for people as for why Final Fantasy XVI is hated for. But I still think that the gameplay is one of the game's strongest suits, only second to its majestic musical scores and or its story. The amount of possible builds that you can do, the combos that you can execute, the flashy animations of each ability, if nothing else, you can at least say that Final Fantasy XVI's combat system is a far cry from what they tried to do with Final Fantasy XV, and I think that alone is more than enough reason to give this game some slack. It tried something new, and I really think it's for the better. There are still a lot of things to talk about the game, but I think I'm going to end it here. I believe that there's joy in discovering things on your own as you play the game. This video would turn into a guide video and not a review if I laid out everything that's possible to do in the game. There's an entirely different combat system that you get during specific points of the game that I haven't covered. You have to experience that one for yourselves if you do decide to play the game. You have a training room that lets you experiment on moves and combos, an arcade mode that allows you to replay portions of the game and turn it into Devil May Cry, complete with performance ratings and scores, easily my least favorite thing in the game because again, I fucking hate Devil May Cry. You can change Clive's appearance and get to choose which weapon appearance you want to keep while having another one equipped. There's so much more to this game that's more than for one measly shitty ass video to cover. Final Fantasy XVI is a very cinematic game. You will often hear people complain that they feel like they're watching a movie instead of playing a video game. I have a personal gripe with these types of people, and it's a pet peeve of mine whenever people say that video games are all about the gameplay, not the story, but that's a topic for another video. But allow me to say this. All of the cutscenes that happen during the first 2 or 3 hours of the game set up the story for the other 70 hours of playtime beautifully. It's also part of the gameplay to transition from combat to a cutscene and back to a combat again. Usually the cutscene having some QTEs you need to pass to avoid damage and do tremendous amounts of to your enemy. Long cutscenes and dialogues aren't for everyone, but I really think Final Fantasy XVI really needed that much of an exposition with how deep and well written its story is. Without those cutscenes doing all the world building and fleshing out the main characters, Final Fantasy XVI would have ended up like Final Fantasy XV. An empty open world with banal side quests, a main heroine that I couldn't care less about because she had a screen time of less than an hour before the game killed her, and a nonsensical plot that's only somewhat made sense because of the countless supporting media that the game had, including a whole ass movie and a bunch of novels. Final Fantasy XVI is, at the end of the day, a Final Fantasy game. It may feature a different battle system that's a different cut from its predecessors. It might not have the beloved spells that we all claim to know and love. It might not have turn-based or ATB influenced combat systems, but the lore, the world building, the mythological beings, the storytelling, the characters, everything points to it as Final Fantasy. I think Square Enix made the right decision to make Final Fantasy XVI more action-focused in its gameplay and dark and brooding in its narrative. After more than 15 mainline games, I think it's time for the franchise to switch things up a bit, and Final Fantasy XVI is a really good step in the right direction. Despite its mostly positive reception on Steam, I hope Square Enix doesn't shy away from making more games similar to this. And I don't think it's just an illusion from people who say that Final Fantasy XVI was a flop because, aside from the poor PC performance, I do not see anything to hate the game for. To those people, the only thing I can say to them are the words from Clive Rossfield himself.
The only fantasy here is yours, and we shall be its final witness.
And also, I fucking hate Devil May Cry and I would play literally anything else before I play any game from that franchise.